Hey everybody, it's Matthew, and it's the beginning of July. And as of the beginning of January and beginning of July every year, NVAR has put out new changes to the residential sales contract. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so we have some changes in July of 2022, and there are some general changes that were made and some administrative changes. And one of the victory laps that the Forms Committee took is that they've reduced the form and contracts yet another page in the residential sales contract to bring us down to 11. Really, it's not less content. It was moved in other places. So we will be addressing some of those in just a minute. A couple other changes you'll notice is that there are no longer the little initial lines at the bottom right-hand corner of every page. Instead, it is a one complete document where you don't need to initial every page. It'll be rendered together as a formal document when it's sent over as ratified rather. So you didn't really need the initials on each of those pages anymore. The next thing is that they moved certain of these sections, again, to reduce the contract, but also because contracts should be agreements between buyers and sellers and not necessarily disclosures or protections to brokerages. Those protections go into our listing agreement and buyer agency agreement, which makes them essential and legal to be legally signed and reviewed prior to entering an agency relationship with a buyer or seller. So you'll see things like the Wet Settlement Act, and there used to be a paragraph in the contract. That's now been moved to the listing agreement to make sure you go over it with your sellers and say, hey, look, there's not gonna be money at the table. You're giving buyer keys. In return, you're gonna get the promise of money within 2 days, and the courts are open and settlements made and recording is made, etc. Again, Wet Settlement Act is negotiable. It just often isn't. And so if the buyer and seller want to agree to something other than the seller getting the money after recordation or the buyer getting keys before recordation, that would need to be done separately in an amendment or agreement or addendum to the contract. And then next you'll see places where there used to be hash marks, those lines to the left of a paragraph in certain addendums and documents, is now just a checkbox to say this is the paragraph I agree to, and no, not everybody has an initial in 14 places anymore. So we'll jump right into the standard forms changes. You'll remember back in February, there was a Bureau of Insurance letter that went out and reinforced a 20-plus-year-old law that basically said there really isn't a such thing as split settlements. Sellers can use an attorney to do their closing. Buyer can use whomever they wish and desire to use their closing. But the settlement only occurs at one company. And so to facilitate that, the Standard Forms Committee changed the fees paragraph. The fees paragraph used to delineate exactly the services that a buyer or seller would pay for, and now it's a little bit more general. And so there is no obligation for a seller to pay the settlement fees that a buyer's chosen settlement company presses against them. It is now just part of the negotiations and part of the process. We've talked about this exhaustively since February. So this is just less language with less specificity so that you didn't have to deal with the contract being used against the seller to pay certain fees. Now it is addressing general fees, and who gets paid for it is up to the buyer and seller and who they choose to do their service with. Paragraph 10, they have now merged the access to property and the property maintenance paragraph into one paragraph, which is new paragraph 10, with 11 no longer being called the access to paragraph. In this new paragraph, they've expanded a little bit. As you remember, the last big change to access to property was to be specific as to who could enter the property for final walkthrough or inspections. And it only outlined those individuals which were specifically agreed to by the parties and the buyer broker. So mom and dad can't come to final walkthrough. You can't hire a contractor. Those type of things were cleaned up. In doing that, they became a little too specific. So they widened this to any representative of any inspections which the parties agreed to. And specifically, they use the example of the termite inspectors, which really in the other language wasn't specific, wasn't clear. And so they've cleaned up that language a little bit. And then you'll see here that they've added, again, the second half of paragraph 10 is now just merged access to property in there. And you can see here that there's checkboxes as to who will be able to go through what time period, and then whoever else gets to go in goes in. and it still remains a 7-day prior walkthrough. Paragraph 13, they added under the standard language, these are not checkboxes, under personal property and fixtures, if there is an outdoor sprinkler system or there are bathroom mirrors, those now by default convey with the property. I read that and I'm like, who the hell is digging up outdoor sprinklers to take with them to the new house? But I guess somebody thought they would, so, but now it's also all the components and things. So it's covered. Bathroom mirrors were always a sticking point. Some people have really nice bathroom mirrors and they think they can detach them because they're not glued to the wall and just a couple of screws like a picture. That can't happen anymore. So if your seller wants to take their bathroom mirrors and they want to take their outdoor sprinkler system, they need to either do so before putting the house in the market, or they need to make sure there's an exception made and negotiated in the contract. There has also been added checkboxes under paragraph 3 deposit for who is holding the EMD. The last paragraph wasn't explicit as to who was going to hold the EMD, and now we're going to check the box to say, is the settlement company going to hold it? Is the buyer's broker, or also known as a cooperating broker, going to hold it, or some other third party? So now it's very specific as to what choices you have and who's going to hold it, not just it's going to be delivered to the escrow agent and then you can choose whatever. And then again, we have to fill in the blanks as of the dates. Under finance contingency, you're going to see now, if you look here, you'll see a little square to the left of the A character, to the alpha character. That square is, again, a checkbox now saying these are the paragraphs we agree to, as opposed to initially next to every paragraph, which required counter signatures of the changes and all the rest. If you check the box, and you send it over and the seller goes, no, I don't want that, and they cross through it, you are going to have to initial future changes. But if the default choice of the buyer is left alone, all required is that check box that you see next to each option here. Now, this finance contingency with automatic extension, the language was cleaned up in all the finance contingency addendums to be a little clearer as to what constitutes the release of the finance contingency across the board, and the appraisal contingency has some very similar language as well. And you'll notice it is much more layman, if you will, more standard language, common language, and much clearer as to what is required of the buyer to get out of the contract or terminate it. And very clearly it says, number 3, buyer may void contract by delivering to seller a lender rejection letter anytime prior to the satisfaction or removal of this contingency or expiration of the settlement date. Now, I do want to just spend just a second in this because I've had 2 or 3 of these calls. I don't think I've ever had 3 of these in a year, and then the last 3 in a month, about the buyer terminating and giving kind of a lame lender's letter. Like they're just not real clear as to what they can't qualify for. The lender's just saying they don't have money, or their credit score is dropped, or they can no longer qualify. Because what's happening is as the interest rates get increased, the buyer didn't lock in like they should have, and now the payment's gone up and they're no longer either comfortable with it or they just don't want to buy anymore and they're using it to stick it out. To be clear here, because of the language in the contract, they really only need to deliver that letter. There's nothing else required. The lender denied it, they're done. Now, everything in a contract has to be based in good faith. So if they have intentionally done something to no longer qualify, if you can prove that the buyer or lender is lying, or the lender is giving the exact same loan terms on a similar house 2 doors down for the same price, you may have, or your sellers may have, cause to consider it a bad faith termination. They should seek legal advice swiftly. They can't drag it out. If you don't release EMD and you start screwing around timelines, there's all these sorts of problems that exist that people use the phrase civil theft and other things, where you're preventing the buyer from rightfully getting their money back by screwing with them because of what the law says or the contract. It's not worth the time. So unless you can prove, or you have pretty solid evidence that the buyer or lender acted in bad faith, that they lied, cheated, stole, did something intentionally to disqualify themselves from the good faith promises of the contract, this is all that's really needed, is this lender letter. So it's a very simple statement. It's a very simple process, and it was intentionally done that way. It doesn't help your sellers, and I get that. But there's defenses for the sellers and buyers all throughout the contract that are somewhat less than equitable or fair So this is one of them that benefits the buyer. Also to say that the finance contingent with automatic extension is just what it says. You get up to a certain date and you keep going unless the sellers take action. The second option is the financing contingency without expiration. This expires. And anytime after that, if you don't buy for any reason related to financing, you're probably in default and you probably have some penalties there. Of course, the seller wants option B, the buyer probably wants option A. Also, a change in the addendum in the seller's post-settlement agreement. In the seller's post-settlement agreement, there has been a change to clarify the obligations of the seller who's remaining in the house. Now, this is anybody who has taken classes with me or listened to me talk about this for even 5 minutes know I absolutely despise buyer and seller post-settlement agreements. They are done far too flippantly with agents throwing that idea out there where they should be much more done only when you have to do it because it creates so many problems. I get so many phone calls, not just within our own firm, but others, where brokers were trying to figure out what to do with this or that because of something that's happened in the property. This paragraph is going to help some of those common questions we get. The seller is required to maintain and repair the property for basic things like electrical, plumbing, appliances, heating, air conditioning, equipment, fixtures, and leave it in exactly or substantially the same condition as of the settlement date. So in other words, you've got to do your walkthrough there at the settlement time, and you document the house. And I always encourage your buyers when they go through to do their final walkthrough, they do it just like if they were just moving in the next day. They do a walkthrough about 6 days before closing to make sure all home inspection items are done. They do a second walkthrough the night before or the morning of closing, even if there's a seller rent back. They take their phones, they walk around the room and videotape everything in the house so that if there's any challenge about, well, that carpet was stained when you did your settlement or whatever, you've got it on video. This should happen in every single closing, which is a seller's post-settlement. That is really the only strong evidence we have as is the condition property on settlement date. Now, this paragraph goes on to say that the change in this paragraph went on to say, dear buyers, you need to understand that the house may be damaged if you decide to do post-settlement, that there may be conditions of the property and other problems with the property that could occur. So there's a kind of a disclosure to the buyer that if you're allowing the sellers to remain afterwards, you understand that there could be damages and things to the property, and we really can't do much as agents after the fact. You need to seek legal advice. Now, again, this is a restatement of who's responsible for those elements. In the paragraph 6, which that paragraph references, is when we come back to the disclosure that during the seller's post-settlement occupancy, the buyer bears the risk. They understand that things may happen, fire, floods, act of God, casualty, all these things, that they're still responsible for that home should these things occur. In other words, you need insurance. That's essentially what this paragraph is saying, is that all these things can happen, and now you're the owner renting back to the seller. The prior paragraph says the sellers are responsible for keeping things in good working order, maintenance things, fixing things before they leave, just like a tenant would. The buyer is being told that understand that those are routine things. If there are big things like fire, flooding, acts of God, I'm not sure. God hasn't flooded the earth for a long time, but if he did, or other casualties, that's the buyer's responsibility. Any personal property not included in the sale and kept by the seller should be at the seller's risk. So this is telling, hey, seller, any personal belongings you have will not be under the buyer's homeowner's insurance. That's on you, and that means you should probably have renter's insurance or check to see if your current homeowner's insurance will cover you after the buyer has closed. And guys, let me just, I say this every time, everybody ignores me every time. If you're doing a post-settlement, you should have some written statement, which is basically in the contract, but an email at least, to say, hey, sellers, you need to check with your settlement, with your insurance rather, to make sure they cover you during the rental period after you've closed. Some insurance companies may not cover you once the house is now in the buyer's name. And if you're concerned about your personal property or anything in the house, you should get some type of short-term insurance if it's available to you. And so the seller will hold the buyer harmless for loss or damage of any personal property. So if you are the buyer or the seller rather, and you're remaining in the house and the fire damages the house and burns it to the ground, all your personal stuff, you're not holding that. The buyer's insurance is not going to cover you. If you don't have insurance in place, or if your insurance company stopped coverage after the day that the title was transferred, you may just be completely lost to that stuff with no way to be compensated for it. And so then it goes on to say the seller is responsible for maintaining insurance to cover the seller's personal property if desired during this period, and until the seller vacates the property in accordance with the deadline. And buyer will maintain homeowner's insurance adequate to protect the buyer's insurance. So again, paragraph 6 is to say you too are responsible for your own stuff. And I think we don't do a good enough job explaining that to those clients at that time. Anyways, that's it. That's a real quick overview of the changes and things to look at. There'll be some other little things you'll see. Again, a lot of those paragraphs that had to do with the buyer's responsibilities or duties, or the seller's responsibility duties between the agent and client, are no longer restated in the contract. They've been moved to listing agreement, buyer agency agreement, where they probably should have belonged all along. Do make sure you're covering every single paragraph with the buyer or seller before they sign those agreements, so to make sure that you have put them on notice and made them aware of the things they need to know. That's it. Thanks so much. If you have any questions, reach out to your broker, so they'll be sure to help you.